Hey, everybody, I'm back. And thanks, everyone, for, first of all, informing me about Tosh Tahombe, what happened to him. What do you think about that, Mike? This is my friend Mike Jacobs from the PMSA, Pacific Maritime Shipping Association.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, don't know what's really going on behind the scenes, but we spent a lot of time with Taj over a couple of years pre-pandemic, um, and obviously we're on separate sides of the issues, but he was always active and engaged, and sometimes was the best spokesperson for the project and given the circumstances. So, you never wish anyone ill in their career, and hope everything that went down is relatively copacetic.
Would you consider hiring him? He needs a job out there. It was kind of like a, you know, we got to get this man a job.
I don't think given the circumstances, I don't think we'd be able to offer him enough money.
Hey, desperation produces a certain bedfellow. I mean, you never know. Right? It's just it would be interesting to have him on the other side of the coin. You never know. But
well, and as this especially just East Bay in general, but Oakland in particular, it's a very small town. So you'll see the same folks on different issues and over the years, and so obviously any opportunity to work together with folks is a good one. And I would say just on that same score, no one was reaching out to us about the ballpark project until your good friend and mine, late Tom Guarino, reached out to me and said, "Hey, have you been talking to the A's about this ballpark stuff yet?" And I said no, and the person he had reach out and get in contact with us was Taj. So
yeah, Taj is a good man, and in fact, Taj is in a lot of ways like Tom. As I think about it, so
different wardrobe.
Yeah, well, yeah. Hey, no one can rock the Tommy Bahama like Tom Guarino. That's the fact. That's a fact. Hey, so talk to us about this lawsuit, latest one you filed, which is what now, the fourth? Actually, it's more. I think it's the fifth in total regarding this project, right?
Yeah, this is our third lawsuit. It is the fifth in total if you include the two from the railroads.
Right.
And I think that the obvious issues that are in front of everyone from the EIR are looming large over everything, and they loom large over the BCDC efforts too. And the suit itself has three different components to it. One of them is clearly related to the environmental review process, and BCDC, as you'll recall, took an interesting tack with the Bay Plan amendment that they adopted, where they removed the port priority use, and essentially tried to define their activities with respect to this project as only being the actual act of removing the port priority use, which is a correct definition of what their actual action in front of them was. But from a CEQA perspective, you don't get to segment out the impacts of what you're doing in that succinct of a way. You need to look at the entirety of the project and see how you fit in. BCDC is claiming to be the lead agency for that process. Obviously, for this project, they are not the lead agency. And there's some issues there that need to be reconciled. Obviously, we identified those in multiple different comment letters, sent 4 different comment letters between us and our colleagues at the Alliance on the question of, please, BCDC, get your story straight. Are you a lead agency or not? And if you are a lead agency, then why aren't you doing a full evaluation of all of the impacts that need to be mitigated? And if you're not, why aren't you responding to our comments regarding the impacts that you haven't been looking at in the context of your policies? And the policies we're actually most interested in, you won't be surprised to learn, are the same things we told them. Protecting industrial property and the preference for industrial properties that are water dependent. And then analyzing what happens when those uses get displaced. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's a theme in our environmental impact report litigation with the A's at the city, with the city as the lead agency. So those are very similarly aligned with another cause of action in our complaint, which is, kind of a more traditional complaint about the commission not going through its own policies and acting in an arbitrary and capricious way when you compare those to the facts on the ground. And the way that they handled their Seaport Planning Advisory Committee process. And a lot of that was driven by the statutory requirement that they act within 140 days, which was part of the legislation the A's sponsored to try to hurry this along. So, in that respect, our lawsuit is pretty much the legal embodiment of the question of, can you accelerate that process and substitute speed for being thorough? And we think the answer to that is no. Even if the legislature told you do it faster, it did not say you get to take shortcuts on the substance. So in any event, some media outlets might have labeled this lawsuit frivolous. Obviously, we would disagree with that. But I think that the themes are all very, very clear. We had some very, very robust public comments on these issues. And the thing that I find most surprising about the whole thing has actually been the relative lack of response by the A's in the media. When we filed our CEQA litigation, you'll recall that there was a pretty aggressive pushback. Yeah. There was a narrative about how this was expected, but it's expected because California is a very hard place to do business in, and that's why we have to maintain a parallel path in Southern Nevada. Didn't even hear that. Out of this.
Why do you think that is? I have one theory, but I just want to hear your thought.
I
think they're running out of money in certain areas, and they didn't want to pay PR to do that. That's just a theory.
Well, maybe, but I think it can compare and contrast with the response that we got from the mayor, and her response was, we were expecting this the whole time, and they should have. And I think she's right to say that when they look at all of our comments. But Dave Cavill's response was how surprising it was, and they were acting like they were surprised by not having a response prepared. Mm-hmm. So that I do think that's a little interesting, and maybe there's some truth to what your theory is. That they're trying to pick and choose their battles, but their narrative on the parallel path was their go-to for their litigation in the past. I don't know why they would step away from that. And certainly they had the in-house communication staff pick up the phone. It doesn't cost them any money to call a couple of reporters and say, this just, reinforces why we need to have parallel paths. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why they didn't do that.
Or even least cost alternative is to issue a video or a tweet or a video, or if they had hired Zennie62 Media, we can handle it for them, in a different way, but more effectively. But I have to ask you this question, since I'm the one that called the lawsuit frivolous, and I own up to that. To me, it was out of the norm, I'll just say a hyper intellectual approach that you took. And when I looked at it, my first thought was, I thought BCDC's role was more commentative, not so much a lead agency, but the agency that comments, and you say, okay, well, they feel we comment on this EIR, and our comments tell you how to fix it, right? But they're not the final judge and jury. And so in a sense, you're holding them out as judge and jury on the EIR because they do have a terminative or in other words, ability to kill status with the project given the vote regarding the parcel, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So there's some legal confusion there just by design. I get that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, just by design. I get that. Okay. But what I'm going on is that even with that, their habit is to be a commentative body. And if the vote had went your way, which could have happened, the magic question is, would you have still filed a lawsuit like the one you're filing?
Oh, absolutely not. No. And I think the issue that you're identifying is a real one with respect to the different hats that these agencies are wearing at different points in this process. So yes, BCDC obviously is going to be commenting as a responsible agency on the EIR in chief, and they did that. And then they have a regional planning role, which is the process that they were going through right now, which is, they have a discretion and a responsibility under the statute to consider changes to the Bay Plan. And it's basically, the simplest way to analogize that to something else is it's like being the general plan amendment authority for a city or for a county. It's a regional plan, but it's the general planning process when you're designating parcels along the waterfront. And then the next role for them is a ministerial permit role, right? They have a permit that they have to do as well. So there are at least 3 different areas there where they're going to have input into the process. And as you said, this is the first one, which is determinative, where they're taking a discretionary action, and they're doing it in a way which provides a basis for rights for this project, right? So when you're walking through an entitlement process for a development just in general, there are lots of layers to that, right? I mean, in a traditional sense, if you're looking at a bare piece of land, you could go through a process where you're doing the subdivision map, or where you're doing a general plan conformity, and when you're making sure that it's consistent with the zoning. And then you go through a process where you're getting building permits, and you're making sure you get, all the rights to your water straightened out, and, all of those things where you go through those types of iterations. And a lot of those are multi-agency in nature, right? Depending on your use. If you are, talking about building a home or residential housing, you're going to have a different profile with respect to other agency input than if you're doing something industrial, or, kind of the classic is, pick something with an emission source. It could be anything from a crematorium to a factory, anything where you have a potential toxic emission or something noxious in the air. You're going to submit that planning document, whether it's a full discretionary item like a zoning change, or in this case, the EIR for this project at the city level, or the port priority use designation of BCDC. You're going to go through that process, and you're going to notify the air district, and you're going to say, what do you think? But you're going to do the same thing at a permitting level too. You're going to make that available for people to take a real look at it and submit comments, and then get back to you on what kind of conditions you need to place on that project. But you're right. I mean, there's no clear path to just do one thing once on these things. And so that does lend itself to a benefit to folks that are in a position like us, where we're going to look at each one of these discretionary actions separately, right? And we're going to look to see where there are inconsistencies between the policies you're supposed to be enacting and what actually happened, or inconsistencies between the environmental documents that were cleared and what your responsibility is as a responsible agency. And I can assure you that as this project keeps moving through, the more there are internal inconsistencies with responsible agencies and what they should be doing and the EIR or with policy, we're going to be highlighting those things. Can't obviously know what's going to happen in the future. And is that going to happen with DTSC? I don't know. Is that going to happen with the PUC? I don't know. Is that going to happen with the State Lands Commission? I don't know. Is that going to happen at the port? I don't know. But I can guarantee you that each one of those points is a place where we're going to be asking the same questions.
But I have to ask, I mean, last time BCDC took on a sports-related facility matter, it actually acted as the organization that caused a redirection of it, right? So in that context, BCDC could argue, look, we used the same procedure and we came to a point where we rejected the Warriors' initial request. So from that, we can say that we gave you all the same level of scrutiny, and the athletics proposal, same level of scrutiny, and we found it passed.
Yeah.
So
I think that's one of their arguments, right? I mean, I think their argument is pretty clearly that this is a discretionary act on their part, and they're going to argue that it's consistent with their policies and that they went through that process and they did it with eyes wide open and they had an adequate record on which to base that decision. Right?
And they would add, if I were them, that they recently, I believe 2017, added an environmental justice component. So they could then come back and say, hey, we went that route as well, and then pull the transcripts because it did come up, right?
Oh, yeah. And I think on this exact same score, we're going to say, yes, please bring up your environmental justice policy because we want to talk about the facts that we think militate in our favor. And we want to talk about all your other policies and examine whether or not your environmental assessment and your findings line up with those policies and with the facts.
Which leads to my next question. It's not a gotcha. I'm just asking it
Yeah.
before I forget. I'm not going to forget. I'm just poking fun at myself. But do you think that it's actually the environmental justice policy just a Band-Aid, a political Band-Aid, and nothing more? And are you prepared to do that in court?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of emperor has no clothes here. And they need to address it. And I think our suit will help to make that answer known about your question. Is this an effective policy or not? We made the argument in our comments that you essentially do have that emperor has no clothes situation here, because what the staff report said about their environmental justice policy is that it's procedural. That you just have to check the box. Did you have community meetings about this with an impacted community? If the answer is yes, then you've met the goals of the environmental justice policy. And we said, when you read this, it doesn't look like it's a procedural requirement. It looks substantive, right? You're supposed to be protecting these communities, reducing emissions, reducing impacts. And that doesn't sound like what was being laid out with respect to this project. And in fact, several of those commissioners at that first hearing at the beginning of June really felt that was a pro stadium comment. Right? It was a bit of a gotcha where they assumed, wow, you industrial folks, we're getting rid of you. This is going to be better for the community. But they didn't look at the facts. And part of the reason why they couldn't look at the facts was not their fault. It's because it's not included in the environmental assessment. And that was one of our major criticisms. It's like, where's the air quality component? Where's the water quality components? Where are the conversations here? And basically, if you were looking, you would basically just see in the staff report that they did not touch on the specifics for this project. They talked about West Oakland in general, that it's an impacted community, that it has disadvantaged communities that are proximate to this project site. And then they said, and the A's in the city have this robust community process. Therefore, your environmental justice policy has been satisfied.
But is it their responsibility to essentially do the job of the Air Resources Board? And I mean, because you touch on a lot of areas that are, they're, multi-jurisdictional, right?
Yeah,
at what point,
absolutely.
I mean, at what point do you stop? Because if to take your point of view to its logical conclusion, I've spent years analyzing this thing.
Well,
at some point you got to stop.
Hey, preaching to the choir, my friend, because the answer is it takes years to do these projects and to do the environmental assessments. And so, from our point of view, representing marine terminals, other folks at the port, when we're redeveloping an existing terminal, let's say this was Howard Terminal, let's say it was 2022, but there was no A's Stadium project. But one of our members showed up and said, we want to do a project. We want to use it as a terminal. It would take us years to go through the environmental process to redevelop the terminal for an existing industrial use without going through any of these hoops. Because, we wouldn't be changing the use designation at BCDC. We'd be operating consistent with all the policies. We wouldn't be asking them for any discretionary review. We would ultimately ask them for some permits associated with, construction and upgrade of the facility, I'm sure. But even then, we'd be asking for you to do reviews of all of the potential program impacts from a project, right? And it would take years. And most of it would be with all due respect, a regurgitation of a lot of the work that's already done, as you say, at other levels by other agencies, right? So if we walked in and we said, here's the basis for why we believe we have less than significant impacts on air quality, we would go back to the regulatory process that developed the existing rules for commercial harbor craft and for cargo handling equipment and for ocean going vessels and for trucks. And so, we would essentially be relying on a lot of other regulatory layers to help justify a less than significant impact determination for those types of activities. So you're right. I mean, there's an onion. You got to peel back those layers. And CEQA is a real bear of a process, whether you're on either side of it, it's a bear.
But the reason why we have fast track legislation is to, in a sense, get around or, stop us from having to peel the whole onion, right? Knowing that we can get to a point and be able to determine, as BCDC did with the Warriors' proposal at Pier 32, hey, we know that this isn't just going to work, right? And so I go back to, and this is why I called it frivolous. So I thought, and it wasn't to be insulting, but it was to give an honest assessment of what I thought was going on from an organization that normally doesn't issue such lawsuits. I mean,
right. No, I
get it was an emotional response. That's
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, I think the long and short of where we are right now is the system is set up to be easier to say no. And we're going to be taking the opportunity to leverage those portions of the system which are set up to say no.
Exactly. This is what it looked like to me when I first saw it. It was like the system is set up to say no. We talked about it a ton of times, but it was almost like you're looking at this screen and the line of a touchdown is a no, and the defense is supposed to stop them, and the defense didn't stop them. You're like, God damn it. Your defense fucked up, and I'm gonna like, that's what it looked like to me. And I'm like, seriously?
Maybe the better analogy is they got a pick six in it, and we threw the flag late, and everyone was celebrating in the end zone. And we were like, wait a second. I think, look, at the end of...
Or are you like Tom Landry when he would say to his defense, I gave you a perfect game plan, you blew it. I mean...
when I think, the important thing to remember is when we're going through these processes is that there are discretion points along the way, right?
Yes.
And some of them are more significant than others. And some of them confer rights. Where those discretion points confer rights, like this will, changing a land use designation has the propensity to lead one to have a change in rights. That's where you're going to see the most scrutiny. And that's appropriate. There are also places where you have final actions that ask stakeholders to make decisions. So we had 30 days to make a decision as to whether or not we felt that this was a good decision or not, or consistent with CEQA or not. In the context of our existing litigation over the EIR, we felt it was actually most consistent with that litigation to file here as well. So at some point, I think I take your point that if we had had a different outcome, we wouldn't have cared about the adequacy of the environmental assessment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's absolutely, true for everyone. Everyone's allowed to make their own determinations about litigation and, what you want to enforce or not. Maybe go back to your earlier conversation with me too about the warriors on the waterfront. We don't have an active port at the Port of San Francisco on Pierce 3032. But I showed up at the BCDC whenever that was 5-6 years ago and opposed the Warriors arena just on principle. Mm-hmm. Ironically, at the time, I was joined by Gene Kwan, who felt it was really important to preserve the trust and the Tidelands trust on Pierce 3032. Yeah, I don't think she has a long-term interest in that, but it sure was a good argument to make if you wanted to keep the Warriors in town.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a lot to that, where systems are set up to help winnow issues, right? Narrow them down. And if you know earlier than later that you're not going to be approving someone's application, the Warriors and everyone else is better off for not having gone through a full-blown process with BCDC just to have that turned down.
Yeah, absolutely. They were rescued by that. What's the next? My question is, what's the next step with the lawsuit? What are the dates looking like?
Well, in the BCDC lawsuit, there aren't any dates yet. But on the EIR litigation, all the briefing was complete as of yesterday. And that is, as you know, on a fast track. That hearing is going to be on August 19th, Alameda County Superior Court.
And both the same judge, I believe?
I don't.
I think so.
I'll have to look. I wouldn't be surprised if I have to.
It should be, shouldn't it? I think.
It's likely that they would be.
Yeah.
So when you on the BCDC lawsuit, when you first come in, you get an assignment, and those assignments don't always line up. I would often need to go through a process of actually identifying related litigation and then re-referring it to another judge. That there's a role for the parties to decide whether or not they want to do that, depending on which judge they get. And off the top of my head, I don't remember where we are with that.
Hey, I'm curious, since it's the East Oakland Stadium Alliance, have you actually considered partnering with the African American Sports Entertainment Group?
No. I think we have had some conversations with ASEG, but they were very early on. They were 2 years ago. They were very honest and direct with us, and they basically said, "Look, we want the A's to be business partners with us in the case that they need to be at the Coliseum."
You heard our cause.
I don't think they thought that we were going to be all too helpful with that relationship. So
that's fair. I look at it entirely differently. That's interesting. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I think in general, everyone's in the same boat, right? They're all waiting to see what happens. And you have a lot of strange bedfellows in this project already. I would be in their same shoes if I were them. I would want to keep my door open to everybody. They obviously were appreciative of our position that we felt that this type of investment should be happening in East Oakland. That's their pitch, right? Their pitch is that the Coliseum location is entirely viable for full sports venues, for housing, for commercial development, for all kinds of stuff. They believe that there's a role for that property, and that it shouldn't just be an afterthought. And so the portions of our alliance that are all about, let's reinvest in East Oakland, we're very supportive of a lot of what the African American Sports Entertainment Group and what the Dave Stewart Group were trying to do as well. I think that's a conversation that we would love to have. But in the meantime, we also don't want to overstep our bounds and do anything which would get us crosswise with anybody else with that property.
Because my thought is that politically, a strategy that I would have, and I think still could be unleashed, is to say, here's our design for a new ballpark at the Coliseum with a new water table platform, with the on-off ramps. Here's our willingness to pony up, $150 million over X number of years to help get that going. We'll pay the pre-development costs and spread that over. I think it was 17 clients, something like that. Somewhere in there you've got of varying capabilities of revenue, right?
I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And we've talked about this before on previous shows too. I don't think anyone believes that we're going to surrender 150 acres of prime real estate to sea level rise out there.
Right.
You have to defend that site. You have to harden it. That's the opportunity, frankly, that we want communities to have, especially in underinvested communities like in East Oakland, right? You want to create an anchor tenant with a major project that throws off enough revenue to do things through, surprise, surprise, a tax increment financing model where you capture that value and then you turn around and you put it back into public infrastructure that's otherwise not revenue producing.
And that model works. But the other reason I offer it is because this goes all the way back to a paper I wrote called Jumping on the High-Tech Bandwagon While I Eat Ticket. And for those of you who don't know what an e-ticket is, or you were too young, You should know what an e-ticket is, because historically an e-ticket was that premium ticket that got you the major rides at Disneyland, and is now really expensive. But I digress. What I discovered is that, and it still holds true all the way up to this point in this project you and I are talking about right now, is Oakland has this tendency to say, hey, that project is not entirely for the Black community for A, B, C, and D reason. So we're going to cut off its construction. You can pick the project, the Rouse Company. I mean, and goes on and on and on. And what happens is that nothing happens, as opposed to the strategy that I'm suggesting, where you have an alternative so that development does happen and the money does go to an area that is predominantly BIPOC, right? And because we have decades of the other process, of the other dynamic, but we don't have any example on the non-port side. Port of Oakland's a different story, of a project that's public-private financed, not primarily housing, but public-private financed, that's job producing, that indeed is an area that's predominantly Black and other people of color. We have a history of rejecting anything that's not there, but then the organizations that spend all this time ginning up these arguments do nothing to form those developments. And then one could say, what about AASEG and what about Dave Stewart? And my retort is that they were warring against each other. And they were not working in unison to make something happen. And the athletics are effectively playing them off each other. And so it was another dynamic of the same problem. And the athletics are focusing on Howard Terminal, right? So,
I guess you want to take this one step further. If you're looking at the East Oakland, context in particular, the city did a good job of setting up the table for this project better than anything else by going out and doing the specific plan EIR that they did.
Yep.
Basically to tell the development community, here you go, right? Here are the ways you could redevelop this project, and we've pre-cleared it for you environmentally.
Right.
So you could step in through the entitlement process and know, which is hard to tell people, and know that you're on solid footing with respect to your environmental clearances. And that's kind of the biggest gift they could have given. And it still didn't work out. Maybe this goes back to another issue, which is the question of whether or not the A's are actually an organization that's properly capitalized.
And you just fell right into my next question.
Right? Because
if
you had an interest in half of that property, and let's say you still wanted to do Howard Terminal, and you were dead set on that, and there's no plan B in Oakland, like we've heard 100 times, right? Your only plans are Howard Terminal or Las Vegas. Wouldn't you still, and actually have an incentive to try to get revenue operations off the ground at the Coliseum location as soon as possible in order to help finance the other project? And there's one reason why you wouldn't do that, and that would be you're undercapitalized. That you don't have the power to actually sustain either project, much less both.
And that's why I always felt, Mike, that and I said this to the mayor. I said, if I were in charge of the project, the first thing I do is find a development partner, because Cobble told me they needed one. And that leads to this. Phil Ruffin, who has some interesting connections with the president who just had his house raided, our former president, was in town reportedly last week. I don't know for how long. And the report is that, and I believe this is a guess, is more of a hypothesis than anything else, even though it's not presented that way, that Mr. Ruffin is trying to convince John Fisher and company to build their ballpark at the Las Vegas Fair Festival ground, something that I predicted was going to happen last June of 2021. And that news went quiet for some time, but I kept monitoring, and all of a sudden, whoop, up pops Phil Ruffin. But I thought of this. Normally, the travel direction has been from Oakland to Las Vegas, right? Why in the heck would he come the reverse? And I have a hypothesis. I believe, just by circumstance, that what they're considering is a way to maintain Howard Terminal, but build the ballpark in Las Vegas.
That'd be tough.
When and therein lay my question to you. What would the PMSA's reaction be to that?
Yeah, that would be tough. I mean, the way that the initial non-binding development agreement with the port has been laid out is that the stadium is the anchor for the rest of the development. In fact, they can't even move forward on the second phase under that non-binding term sheet unless they've completed the stadium first. So they would have to totally revamp that entire agreement with the port. And, it gets back to our primary concern. Our primary concern is with the 24/7 uses at that site. It's with housing, it's with office, it's with everything else. The stadium, obviously we have a philosophical problem with replacing that property with a stadium. But the mitigation associated with the stadium is much easier and much more direct, right? When you're thinking about things that we care about, you can mitigate traffic on an event by event basis much easier than you can on a 24/7 basis, right? Questions about long-term change in the neighborhood. Actually, in some respects, that breaks our way if you had a stadium but it wasn't on the water, right? So when we look at long-term threats to what we do, redevelopment of industrial lands, losing the industrial property is one thing, but it's complicated and it's made worse by what happens to it. And what happens to it is it turns into residential property. So it's a 1-2 for us, right? You're losing industrial property, which is where we can grow. And if we don't have the acreage, we can't grow. But then if you lose it because it's being redeveloped as housing, then not only have we lost the opportunity to grow, we have new mitigation measures we need to do. Our costs become more expensive, and we have neighbors that we don't want to have right next to us, right? And so that's a challenge that when you look at other redeveloped waterfronts that incorporate sports into those waterfronts, those actually protect our operations. So in Seattle, when you redevelop the Kingdome and you build, the new home of the Mariners and the home of the Seahawks, and you're looking at CenturyLink, those create permanent buffers against the expansion of downtown Seattle into our business.
Right.
They create permanent natural buffers. Same thing in San Diego. Petco Park and the Convention Center in San Diego are natural permanent buffers that keep, the redeveloped gas lamp and the rest of downtown San Diego from moving into the 10th Avenue Marine Terminal. Those are good buffers for us. So the same way, you could do those things if you weren't building this stadium on Howard Terminal, but you were doing a redevelopment, even if we lost the industrial property associated with it, if you were redeveloping the 3rd Street corridor or something, that type of thing actually would be a buffer, and would be a permanent buffer, and would retain a lot of that that separation that we want to have between residential expansion in our operations.
Mike, I have to ask, given that, why not hammer the city for not paying attention to what we call meetings, incentives, convention, entertainment industry, the MICE industry. Oakland's exposure in the MICE industry is pitifully poor. I had Pat Cashman, I don't know if you remember or know Pat,
Oh yeah,
tell
yeah.
me
No, Pat
when
well.
I had this idea for a new Raiders stadium that in part took $400 million from a 1,100 room hotel wing on its side. I calculated out how to throw off his net operating income, right? And he said, there hasn't been a major hotel built in Oakland in 10 years. I said, well, what does that pattern have to do with anything, Pat? I have Kevin Corner, who's the president, not his last name at the time, of the Hotel Council of San Francisco, telling me they have a 16,000 hotel room shortage in Oakland. It was a great idea for Oakland. So who am I going to trust? You or him? And the reason why I had that conversation is that they had my idea in the room, but they were too afraid to call me. You get this and ask me to explain it, right? He says a good idea can explain it without you being there, which is completely BS because they didn't know what they were talking about. So my point is, my point is, and Pat actually hired me to work for the city of Oakland in '86 from Cal. Okay, just thanks, Pat. But I'm just saying he created the monster, if you're wondering. But the whole point is that you had the opportunity, okay, to build the mice industry. We don't do it, and here you're saying basically that unknowingly, all right, that hey, sports part of the mice industry, adds the hotels part of the mice industry, adds the ballrooms part of the mice industry, is great as a buffer for us, but you're not promoting it as alternative economic development. And that gets into my central crux with
Right.
the direction you all are taking, which falls right in line with what we've done historically in Oakland. There's always a reason to stop something, but there's never a raison d'etre to do something, to have an alternative. And what I'm saying is
Right.
I'm just begging for an answer as to why psychologically that is.
Well, and I think it gets back to your question, which was, should we theorize that the stadium's going to go to Las Vegas, but we'll end up with just housing on the waterfront, and that would be our nightmare.
Right. And Open Mayors has our Town for All program, which basically assures that's going to happen. She has said, I'm laying this out so that we can have Howard Terminal without the stadium. She's made that statement.
Yeah, and I think you could also interpret that as saying we could also have all of these infrastructure improvements without the stadium, which also means, to my mind, that you could also have those infrastructure improvements without the housing and without the office space too.
Yeah.
Um,
So does that mean you're going having how come you haven't gone to war against her other legislation has been zooming through council?
so much of that right now is going to be determined by the EIR. Our focus is on the EIR, right? If there's no stadium um, and there's no project there, then a lot of those other grant opportunities actually benefit us. If you're reducing street level congestion, if you're improving streetscapes and walkability in the existing Jack London Square area, that's good for us. Um, reducing congestion, getting more people out of cars and onto buses or localized transit and all those other things that they're talking about doing. The Broadway corridor, to the extent that that relieves traffic off of Third Street and off of the on ramps and off ramps at 880, which everyone knows are constrained. That's good for us. And so, same thing with the port grant. I got to tell you, if we weren't motivated before there was $250 million to the port on the line to fight against the stadium, we are now, because that appropriation stays there if there's no stadium.
Right.
So if there's no stadium, there's $250 million to help us do things like rebuild the Adeline Street overpass in our heavyweight corridor, get the 7th Street grade separations done. We've been waiting on those for over a decade. Real good things that help us move freight faster, more efficiently. So, I think for us, the more grants the city gets, the more grants the port gets, great. And
So is
in the
that just
context of stopping the stadium, that's a good thing.
I know you. I want to clarify. 'Cause I know you said no, but I want to clarify. So does that to say that you're okay with Phil Ruffin coming in and saying, "I will finance the condo and office portion of Howard Terminal, even if so that the stadium goes in Las Vegas. Well, I get the prime
No,
land in the
yeah,
Bay Area. You know,
absolutely not. No, and I don't think that's
I think, I
that's
think
realistic.
I think the mayor is setting that up.
You know, if I
That's
think
what
I
it
would
looks
have
like to me.
agreed with you, I would have agreed with you a couple years ago, because the draft downtown Oakland specific plan um, was basically a blueprint to move 30,000 people west of 880, right?
Hmm.
And uh, as it's been revised, it is no longer clear that that's exactly what they're intending to do. So there's some hedging of the bets there. Um, I think a lot of this
That's the
obviously
case,
turns on the
but I
stadium.
don't. But if right, but if that's the case, though, how do you justify $12 billion of build out, of which only 2 billion is a stadium? Okay, because all Ruffin has to do is come in and say, "Yeah, that's really valuable land. If you guys have the approval to do it, I'll I am your sugar daddy. I will finance that happening. You come to Vegas."
And they need a financier.
Right. And he would
They
be
need
it.
the capital.
And
Um,
here's the thing, Mike. Here's what I'm getting at. Why would he come to town? Because he did do that. He's 82 years old. He can hang out in Vegas. He doesn't need to get on a plane and come to town, but he did that. Why? Why would, I mean, let's speculate. Why would he do that?
he loves the Bay Area in summer. I don't, I don't know. It's an hour flight away on your private plane. Uh, Fisher came to his house for dinner last time. They're having stovetop at Fisher's house this time. So yeah, I don't know.
Or maybe he's never seen Howard Terminal and they're making a hedge on the future of the Bay Area's growth. And they want to, this is my speculation. I'd love to hear you respond to. I think the mayor talked them into this. I think it's her pledge, her shot, her attempt to make sure that her project down there is built when she's gone by having Phil Ruffin come in, because she doesn't care that he's a Trumper in this instance. She really doesn't. She cares about the dollar signs, okay? That's how Libby rolls, all right? So I believe, this is just my hypothesis. Call me crazy. But I think she's the one who said, why don't you have Phil Ruffin come in and meet us and we'll give a tour, we'll keep it quiet, and have him be the financier for your project here. And so if you decide you want to do the stadium there, you can.
I think that's
And,
possible.
here's why
I
I
think
say,
it'd be a pretty heavy lift.
and here's why I say that gives me extra energy. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I have to
Yeah.
complete because it'll make more sense when I say it. She's the one that gave the Athletics. First, she said you choose either Howard Terminal or the Coliseum, right? In the ENA, but they chose both, and she didn't object. And so, what were they going to do with the Coliseum? Observers filled in the blank and said, "Oh, it's a baseball village. It's a baseball village." It wasn't a baseball village. They were land banking it. So my point is, Libby, my hypothesis is continuing the land banking at Howard Terminal by saying you can have that and do what you want to do in Vegas.
Yeah, I guess without a stadium, that's a heavy lift. I mean, you'd have to redo your EIR. You'd have to reconfigure the agreement with the port. You'd have to totally reconfigure the agreement with the city too. But here's what I think is interesting about the hypothesis is that you do need more working capital. It's pretty obvious John Fisher isn't going to be doing this by himself.
Right.
And the idea that there's more opportunity by controlling property is not a new idea. And so the more entitlements you get, the better. It gives everyone more options with respect to what is the future of this team as an asset vis-a-vis what is the future of this property as an asset? If you're the if you're looking at this from the ownership perspective, what becomes the bigger commodity? The value of the entitlements for the balance of Howard Terminal, or the liability associated with having to build the stadium? And there's some interesting permutations there, right?
Very much so. Yeah.
Would you use the housing and the value of the housing to give yourself a free stadium? Maybe. But would you do the opposite? Would you sell the team, including the responsibility to build the stadium, in order to use that as the down payment to finish out the development of the property for your housing?
I should add this, though, that right. Don't forget, though, that the A's could clear $2 billion in sponsorship revenue from the stadium. So that sponsorship revenue alone can go to right. Not that they would use it for all that. They would use it for, they would leverage part of it with tax increment financing from the infrastructure part, and then keep the rest of it. The model that they were after is what happened with the Warriors at Chase. That was $2 billion worth of sponsorship revenue.
So it begs the question, Zennie, I'll turn this back to you before we wrap it up, which is then, and if you're talking about the length of lease terms we're talking about, which is decades, why are you quibbling about $150 million here or $250 million there on the community benefits side? Why are you quibbling about the offsite costs for your affordable housing components?
I got a quick answer to that.
Oh, yeah.
Because the city hasn't properly calculated its tax increment financing revenue. That's why. Because you have a report that they're still referring to from Century Urban that only takes 20 years, a 45-year bond period. 20 years, and they run around with this idea that, well, you have to wait for the money to grow. Why don't you guys just admit that you don't know how to do the calculation to really, pull out the $800 million that you're going to get when you got a property down there that's part of a region in Jack London Square area that's had an average rate of growth in assessed value over the last 15 years of 6.3%. They get 2% growth automatically from the government. They got an average 4% growth. You calculate based on that. They haven't produced a calculation on that. Not one. And what Century Urban did, I've said it before, I'll say it again, is criminal. And it's more criminal for the city to allow that sucky, fricked up, messed up, straw person, calculation that they call a consulting report to be the basis for it, and then to quote it, and then to have the project manager turn around, who was hired by your friend, all right, say, oh, well, the revenue is really the actual present value, which is not. You calculate your revenue based on the bond issue debt service that you believe you're going to deal with, and then you take the rest of that and you say, okay, that's my debt coverage money. They didn't even have a document saying that. Everybody else has. And Otto Kaiser Marston started this garbage about present value, but the people who use it say, well, I want to know what this is going to cost right now. Okay, well, fine. You know that cost. You know that. What are you going to do with that knowledge? That's called, like, I call it residual knowledge, just to prove someone wants to say that because it makes them sound like they're smart. That's really all it is. Because when you start using it against, you can't even use it against the bond issue, because the interest rate for the bond issue is different. The rate of growth of the assessed value for the land, you have two variables: the rate of growth of the assessed value for the land and the inflation rate. People don't realize that. They just like to do this talking all the time. And sometimes I'm just going to say this and I'm going to curse. I just want they shut the fuck up with this stuff, because it's driving me, as you can tell, crazy.
Well, that's how we take this conversation from baseball to softball. There you go.
I mean, it's this lack of intellectual rigor, right? I mean, regardless of what side you're on, it's the lack of intellectual rigor that's criminal. That's why I like talking to you, because we talk loud off camera. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the time. I think I think the long and short of this is still the same. That we don't have this project wrapped up. We're a long way from the project being wrapped up. And the conversation that we have been asking for still hasn't occurred, right? Which is where you lay out what you want the final project to actually look at like, and have that conversation about mitigation and what the surrounding community is going to actually be. And it's complicated, it's expensive, and it's hard to do when you're trying to do something fast and cheap.
Stick around in the background.
Yes, sir.
Folks, thanks for watching. That was pretty good turnout for this time of day. I'm surprised. Subscribe to Zennie62, bookmark oaklandnewsnowblog.com, and we'll be back. And hey, save Taj's job. Get his job back. A's, hire him back. Dave, you're watching this. Hire Taj. Hire Taj. Hire Taj. All right. That is this broadcast, folks. We'll see you.